10 p.m. in the UK. It's 4 p.m. here in Mexico City. We are live on the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley, this evening. Today, or tonight, I should say, on the show, we are going to be discussing theory of knowledge, and we'll be having a guest joining us shortly, David Fairweather, who is a physics teacher but also a theory of knowledge teacher, and we'll be discussing what is theory of knowledge, as well as just in general, how can you incorporate it into your lessons, even if you're not a theory of knowledge teacher per se. We're also going to be talking about hinterland and the concept of hinterland, and how can you best incorporate it into your lessons. I'd love to hear from you. Please text in. What are your thoughts on hinterland? How do you incorporate it into your lessons? How do you what do you best use it for, and so forth in your lessons? So welcome to the Late Late Show. We're going to be first starting off by talking about theory of knowledge. Now, both myself and our guest, who is just having a little technical difficulty at the moment in joining us, who will be joining us shortly, are both theory of knowledge teachers. And I'd love to hear from you. Please text in. What are your impressions of theory of knowledge? Do you know anything about it? Have you taught theory of knowledge, or is it a complete mystery to you as well? So please text in. I'm looking forward to hearing from you in the chat, or in the text, I should say, about what is theory of knowledge, but also what is hinterland? How do you incorporate hinterland in your subject specific knowledge? For me, I'm personally a physics teacher primarily by trade, and I find it really important to allow students to be able to understand physics by, I have to apologize, there's a little bit of noise outside of my studio where we are right now, I'm afraid. So apologies for the noise there. Oh dear. So yes, apologies for that. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty here with some car alarms going off outside of my window. It's Mexico City, I'm afraid, and noise is just kind of par for the course. So please accept my apologies if you can hear an alarm blaring. I will move to the back of the room to try and make it a little bit more pleasant to listen to or to join into. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some thoughts about hinterland or about theory of knowledge? Hopefully we can have a discussion under the blaring of the car alarms that are going off outside of my window. It's been super silent here in my office for the past half hour, and then obviously Murphy's Law will kick in and it will be noisy as soon as I go live. So apologies for that. We're talking about hinterland. How do you incorporate it into your lessons? What is it? What do you have thoughts about? But also we're going to be talking about theory of knowledge with David Fairweather, and he's just joined us on the line. Hello, David. Can you hear me?
Hi, Rich. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me there?
We can hear you live and clear. Welcome to the Late Late Show. So
brilliant. Thanks for having me.
No, welcome. It's my pleasure. So welcome. You're also the first guest on the Tuesday night Late Late Show. So it's a privilege to have you on. Before we start talking about theory of knowledge, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your background? Where are you teaching at the moment?
Absolutely. So I'm a physics and theory of knowledge teacher, currently working in Switzerland at a school called Aiglon College. So it's an international school. And yeah, I've been teaching theory of knowledge for about 5 years now, physics for 10 years. And yeah, I think they are really complementary.
Absolutely. So I'm also a physics teacher as well. Oh, sorry, David, if I can just ask you to make sure your headphones are in so we don't get any feedback, that would be perfect as well. Fantastic. So also just as a theory of knowledge teacher, I'm sure a lot of teachers are out there going, what the heck is theory of knowledge? Could you give us a brief elevator pitch, if you could explain it in 30 seconds to a minute? What the heck is theory of knowledge?
Okay, so specifically within the IB, the International Baccalaureate, there is an IB core. That is, students take 6 subjects that are quite varied. There's languages, science, maths, humanities, and theory of knowledge is designed to sit at the core of that, at the center, and link all of those things together and give all those subjects a bigger context, I suppose. So we identify how we know what we know, why we know what we know, how we trust what we know, and look at the similarities and differences across all those different subject areas.
And so you said it was part of the IB diploma program as well. So what aspect, well, what is expected from the students over the 2-year course? And also I should just briefly explain as well for any teachers that aren't aware, the IB diploma program is a sixth form program for years 12 and year 13 in the UK, and it's basically an international equivalent of A levels. So what is expected from students taking theory of knowledge in the IB diploma?
Okay, so in terms of assessment, what's expected is new for this year is the TOK exhibition, so Theory of Knowledge exhibition, where they have to choose from one of 35 knowledge questions and find 3 artifacts, 3 real world objects they can take photos of that represent an answer to that question, essentially. And they have to curate their own mini exhibition. And that's really challenging, really good fun. We've just done that here a week ago. And then the second thing they do is write a 1,600-word essay, again answering a knowledge question. So normally something linking 2 areas of knowledge together.
And these knowledge questions that they have to answer, what kind of questions can the students be expected to answer? What kind of themes are brought up in these questions that they are expected to answer?
Well, they all follow a broad theme. It's all how do we know what we know and how do we use what we know. So trying to think off the top of my head from this year, there were questions such as, is bias inevitable? Or why do we seek knowledge is one of the really big ones. That's a really difficult one to answer. But yes, there's all questions about utility and about production of knowledge.
Absolutely. So I've just got a few texts in. Seb has texted in to say it sounds very interesting, this course. I'd love to, if you have any specific questions about theory of knowledge, please do text in with any either minutiae of what theory of knowledge is or how we implement it as well. And you said that you were originally a physics teacher by trade to start off with. What made you want to teach theory of knowledge?
Well, I think like a lot of people who end up teaching theory of knowledge, I had this curiosity about it, but also there's this assumption that it's a philosophy course, that it's taught, it's really cerebral and it's taught by people who are really, really clever. So I'd kind of ignored it. And it was only when we had another physics teacher in the department who wanted some IB hours. And we said, it'd be really great to get a teaching some IB. So I said, well, how about if I take a few hours a week of theory of knowledge, and that frees up some physics teaching hours. So it wasn't initially through a desire to teach TOK as such. It was more practicalities. And I think a lot of teachers find themselves teaching TOK because they've got some slack in their timetable or something. But it was an accident initially. I haven't regretted it at all. It's definitely made me a better physics teacher, sure.
Absolutely. You're definitely right as well in terms that theory of knowledge teachers are normally conscripted or press ganged into it. I remember when I first started teaching theory of knowledge about 5 years ago, it was because there was an opening on my timetable and the previous theory of knowledge teacher had left. I was kind of interested in the subject, but I was a very rookie teacher in terms of I didn't really quite understand it. I thought it was a philosophy course, when it really isn't a philosophy course. There are aspects of it. So I was kind of just roped into it, and they were like, yeah, you'll probably be fine. You're quite, you're quite nerdy. You quite like these kind of like deep philosophical concepts and things. One student I found, one student I always ask, what is theory of knowledge to you when students enter it in year 12? And one student said to me, I think it's like those, those odd thoughts you have in the shower, which sounds really wrong for coming from a student, but but it was like it's one of those sort of shower thoughts kind of courses. And I was like, well, yeah, I suppose that's the best way you can describe it. It's like what you said. It's how do we know what we know? And you said as well that it made you a better physics teacher and it improved your physics teaching. How do you incorporate elements of theory of knowledge into your physics lessons?
Okay, yes, good question. So it really links to that idea of hinterland that I know is a theme for this evening. So it's more than just telling stories. It's leaving students with questions. So let's say you're teaching models of the atom, and you're looking at how models of the atom have changed through history. That's inherently really theory of knowledge. It's really TOK heavy. And you're showing how all of these models of the atom have been at times useful and then wrong. And leave the students with the idea that actually the current models of the atom we've got are almost certainly wrong and still useful, and leave them with that bigger questions, zoom out again, almost as they're leaving the class, and say, what other models in science or beyond science are probably wrong? And I think leaving them with those questions, that's the conversations that they end up having around the school. And it's really gratifying to hear them talking about, it's always gratifying to hear students talking about your subject, but thinking about those big questions, I think really anchors the facts, the knowledge they're learning within a bigger context.
I completely agree as well. I think I think the models come up so much in theory of knowledge, almost to the point where as theory of knowledge teachers, we get kind of sick of it because they become a little cliche to us. Models of the atom, the heliocentric universe versus the geocentric universe, and the development of that. These are kind of like cliches that get brought up again and again. We have to remember as well, as theory of knowledge teachers, that we've been teaching it for several years, and the students are approaching it from the first time. So we have to be a little understanding when we get them to develop ideas. One idea that I really found really fascinating and actually really improved my teaching of physics, but also of theory of knowledge, was a presentation or a seminar that you gave for Chat Physics. I'm sure a lot of people on Teachers Talk Radio have heard of Chat Physics. It's a Twitter community. A few of our hosts are regular contributors to Chat Physics. And David, you gave a presentation introducing theory of knowledge into the physics classroom. And I think one of the best examples that you give in that in that seminar is how a battery is actually incorrect, or how the flow of, how we label the flow of charge is incorrect. But it leads into a question of, do good explanations have to be true? Which is also a question that was asked in an essay question that was asked that students would have to answer. Would you mind explaining that kind of your thoughts on that a little bit briefly?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you. I'm glad it was a useful chat. Yeah, the idea of electrons flowing around circuits and the direction of currents is a really interesting one. So we've labeled electrons as negative, and there's a whole question about positive and negative and what that really means. But we've labeled electrons as negative, and then charge we think of as flowing in a positive direction around the circuit. So we sort of skip over this when we teach GCSE physics. And at IB or at A-level AP, we have to acknowledge that the direction that we call current is opposite to the direction that the charge carriers are actually moving. And that's fascinating in itself. But the idea that it can be a good explanation while still being a wrong explanation is brilliant, because most of our explanations probably are wrong, almost certainly are wrong. And I think actually tackling those things head on rather than sort of fluffing our way around them makes for far better, more satisfying explanations for the students, and gives us, I think, a more in-depth understanding of the subject that we're teaching.
No, yes, I completely agree. I find in terms of hinterland, that's kind of a buzzword that I don't really use that much, but I've only just sort of discovered what the word is. But my teaching style is through explanation and telling a lot of stories. And I find that theory of knowledge allows me to tell those kind of stories in my subject as well, and the development of physics and the history of physics. But it also facilitates students actually asking questions about how reliable what we know is, and how do we know what we know and how reliable that is in general. Moving on as well, I would just say, like, the IB diploma requires students to take the theory of knowledge course, and it's normally something that it's part of their core curriculum, along with the 6 other subjects that they would have to study, as well as a few other obligations. But I'm aware that a lot of our teachers listening right now probably aren't theory of knowledge teachers. They may not be teaching the IB diploma, or they may be teaching the IB diploma but not actually teaching theory of knowledge. What advice would you give to someone wanting to include elements of theory of knowledge into their lessons, what would be sort of like the basics that people would need to include?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this. If I were to move back to teaching A levels, how would my teaching be different now than it was? It was 9 years ago I was last teaching A levels. I think I would still incorporate a lot of the same teaching styles I'm using at IB, with that theory of knowledge. I think the best thing you can do to with your teaching within the IB or A level or something else, to really get a handle on TOK is to look up the 35 exhibition prompts and knowledge prompts the students are given, because each of those is just a big question. And if you look at those and think, yeah, is bias inevitable? Well, where are there answers to that within my subject? If I'm teaching history, if I'm teaching language, is bias inevitable in language? And you can look at gendered language, and you can, within physics, look at the ways we try and reduce bias. So I think looking at those lists of questions, I think, are there interesting answers to that within my subject, is going to allow for some really interesting conversations, whether you're teaching within the IB diploma or another system.
So yeah, so absolutely, the 35 questions that we're talking about are 35 prompts that are being published by the IB diploma that students need to answer. I can give you an example. I've just pulled up the list here because these are questions that my students are currently trying to answer as part of their theory of knowledge exhibition in year 12. So students will have to pick from 35 questions and basically answer them using 3 objects to sort of answer the question. The idea was kind of developed from the BBC radio show A History of the World in 100 Objects, and it was kind of developed past that. So some of the examples of these questions are: on what grounds might we doubt a claim? Why do we seek knowledge? Are some things unknowable? What counts as good justification for a claim? So it's really, really open-ended stuff, but it's also stuff that really, really encourages the students to think critically. And one of the things that I find really enjoyable about the course is it's something that students have never seen before, which is something that can be very, very daunting for students right at the beginning of year 12. It's something that's completely different to the exam-based subjects that they have mainly seen, but it also really encourages them to really develop their critical thinking skills and really analyze what they know and why they know it. Also, in terms of a theory of knowledge lesson, when you're teaching a theory of a TOK class in school, to you, what would be like the kind of activities or what kind of things makes a theory of knowledge lesson, and how is it different to teaching physics, or how is it different to maybe teaching the subject specialty that a teacher would be most comfortable with?
Yeah, good question. The big difference for me is the students are different. So as a physics teacher, once it gets past GCSE, I'm teaching students who are interested in physics, which means my experience of the sixth form is quite narrow. And I think most subject specialists see a narrow cross section of their sixth form, whereas in a theory of knowledge class, I've got a wide variety. I'm meeting more students, which is brilliant. And now that I'm head of TOK here, I'm meeting all of the sixth form students, which has been really enlightening and a lot of fun. So firstly, the students are different. Secondly, they've got 6 academic subjects plus TOK. So it's important to make that not feel onerous for them. It should be fun. So it's very conversation based. I try and keep it quite activity based where we can. So in the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at art and knowledge produced in art, which is brilliant for me as a physics teacher to be running lessons on what we know from the arts, how reliable artistic knowledge is, and then running activities. What the brilliant activity we do is give the students sort of different color shapes, like inspired by the Matisse cutouts, and get them to produce a piece of art and then justify the value of that piece of art, getting them thinking about what value means within art, both financially and value of knowledge. So lots of activity-based stuff, encouraging some arguments, some debate. Ethical discussions are always great fun as well. Having a class of students debating the trolley problems, the utilitarian deontological arguments are brilliant, and then applying that to different subjects is fantastic. So yeah, lots of variety.
That's one of my favorite subjects as well. We do teach a lot of reason and elements of philosophy in the course, especially at the start of the course. And deontology versus utilitarianism is something that I didn't really know anything about before I became a TOK teacher, and then I learned it very quickly, because it's the classic thing of a teacher put into a brand new course. You have to basically teach yourself the course incredibly quickly. And things I found really, really fun for students is also relating it to popular culture and to media that they're really interested in at the moment. So a couple of years ago, when the Marvel Cinematic Universe was well, it's still very big, but when it was bigger, I suppose, was Captain America Civil War came out, and you can make the arguments that the two main characters there, Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, Captain America, it is an argument of deontology versus utilitarianism, with Tony Stark arguing for the greater good, and deontology and Captain America arguing those kind of elements as well. And I think the students really love trying to find elements of TOK in the real world and in the news, in popular culture. I think at one time when Red Dead Redemption 2 came out, I tried to link it there somehow as well. But yeah, that's some of the stuff that I find really, really fun. So we just got a few texts in from text coming in. Please do, if you have any questions about theory of knowledge or hinterland, incorporating hinterland into your courses over the incorporating them into your courses, please do text in. Seb has just texted in to say, I want to do this course. I think I'm slightly too old though. I wouldn't say that you have to. I don't think age is a limit. I mean, I don't know about you, but I picked it up after teaching for about 5 or 6 years. I don't think age is a limit here. I don't know what you think, David.
No, absolutely. And the activities we make the students do, I'm a big believer in not asking students to do something I wouldn't or couldn't do. So when I first started teaching TOK, I sat down and wrote a TOK essay, and really enjoyed that. Which sounds quite odd saying that now, but it was really interesting to compare two subject areas and answer a question. And I did the same thing with the exhibition this year, was to take a knowledge prompt. I chose one at random and then said, right, I've got a day to come up with an exhibition, and it was really good fun. So it's absolutely anyone can get involved. And your IB coordinator, if you're at an IB school, will absolutely love you if you go to them and ask to teach TOK, because often, because it's got this quite cerebral image around it, it's a struggle to find TOK teachers sometimes.
Absolutely. There's this kind of, I don't know what the way to explain it, but there's this kind of invisible barrier that TOK kind of puts itself up, for want of a better word, where people think you need to have a doctorate in philosophy to be able to teach it.
Yes.
I mean, I'm an elegant physics teacher, and I use 2-syllable words when at all possible. So if I can teach it, anybody can teach it. And I think the most important thing is relating it and making it as relatable as possible. Be it relating it to the news and what's happening, or movies, culture in that respect. And if you like movies like The Matrix, Arrival, Contact, anything like that, those are very heavy. There's so many aspects of theory of knowledge in there. For example, when we talk about language, I show my students the movie Arrival, or set it as a homework for them to go and watch it. And the whole concept of that movie is, does language change the way you think? And can you, if you are bilingual, or if you spoke French and you were the exact same person and you spoke English, does that affect the way you think? And that's a huge element of theory of knowledge. Sorry.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's Rival's a classic TOK film now. And the other thing I really like about teaching TOK actually is that looking across subjects. So our TOK department here, we teach all the lessons at the same time, but we've got So myself as a physicist, there's a maths teacher, there's history, languages, English, economics. Yes, and so we've got a really broad range of teachers, and when we're all sat in a room as a department, the links we make between subjects are brilliant. It's that sort of horizontal articulation that it seems to be quite a buzzword at the moment as well. But it really is that, but it's done in quite a genuine way.
No, I completely agree. The school that I'm in is actually a relatively smaller school. So I've come from a school in Germany which had, when I was theory of knowledge coordinator there, had about 7 people in the TOK department. It was myself, another physics teacher, music teacher, French teacher, history teacher, maths teachers. And I've moved to a slightly smaller school where there's another science teacher is a TOK teacher, and then also a civics and sort of a global perspectives teacher as well. And my department at the moment is absolutely fantastic. They're a really, really great team to work with, and I have a great theory of knowledge coordinator. But one of the things I really, really miss is having a wider group of teachers to bounce ideas off of, because especially if you're teaching at the same time, what you can then do is do team teaching activities, or if you're focusing on a particular area. So for example, if you're focusing on art, then you can have an art teacher take the lead, or if you're focusing on languages or the human sciences, then you can have teachers in that area of specialty sort of take the lead, and then go back to your classroom with your students and have a chat about the activity that you've done, or something along those lines. We've still got a little bit more time to speak, a couple more minutes to be chatting with David. We're talking about theory of knowledge for the first half hour on the Late Late Show, and after that we'll be talking about hinterland and how you can incorporate it into your classes and into your lessons. So David, one other last thing as well is, what advice would you give to a student taking TOK for the first time? Or maybe I should say that if you could go back in time and talk to yourself as a sixth form student and encourage them to take theory of knowledge, what would you say to them to encourage 17-year-old you to take theory of knowledge?
Oh, good question. I think one thing I tell students is it makes you far more interesting at dinner parties, because it gives you the questions about specific subjects which anybody can relate to. It's once you start talking about physics to people who aren't necessarily interested in physics, their eyes glaze over. But if you can bring out some ethics in there and say, yeah, it's this wonderful new discovery, but is it ethically right to pursue that knowledge? Well, that's something that can get people involved. Maybe I'd say that. Maybe people will find you more interesting if you've studied theory of knowledge.
I completely empathize with that as well. When I was at university, I would tell people what I would do. It's like, oh, what are you studying? I was like, oh, I'm studying physics. And there would be the kind of like, oh, great. And kind of just gloss over and try and change the subject very quickly. So I realized very quickly that I'm going to have to lie and say I do something like global politics, because people are going to talk to me if I do those kind of things. David, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for giving up your time. I'm aware as well that you're calling in from Switzerland, which is 11 o'clock or 11:30 there now. So please, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and being on the show this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to another theory of knowledge teacher as well as another physics teacher.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to chat, and some really interesting questions there. So thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, David, and we'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye. So we're listening to the Late Late Show, or you're listening, I'm sorry, I should say, to the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. We've got another hour in on the call. Please text in if you have any questions. David has just left because it is 11:30 his time. But if you have any other questions about what is theory of knowledge, I'd be very happy to discuss it and answer some questions. But we're also going to be talking about hinterland. What is hinterland and how can we incorporate it successfully into our lessons? But before we move on to our next topic, we're just going to pause for a very short commercial break.
In Introducing Amanda Davey. Amanda is one of the first specialist teacher assessors for dyscalculia in the UK and offers dyscalculia tutoring and bespoke training for schools. With 26 years of teaching and tutoring experience in the UK, Amanda offers specialist online tuition focused on building confidence and developing skills. Amanda.
Apologies about that. I made a little mistake there. So all technical gremlins are coming to the forefront in our third show of the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. Please do text in. We're talking today about hinterland. We've been talking about theory of knowledge and how can we incorporate it into our lessons. Complex, I don't think that's your real name, but Complex has just texted in to say, what's the most fascinating physics thing you've ever learned? Well, my degree, I would say, for things that I teach to my students, I think the things that I find the most interesting are just being able to explain things really, really well and with a lot of precision and clarity. So when I was a sixth form student myself, I found the equations for centripetal motion, so objects moving in a circle, and how they could easily, or basically how they could be substituted into Newton's law of gravitation and the forces of attraction between two objects moving in a circle, and how we could combine those two equations to work out the speed of an object orbiting the planet or the speed of a body orbiting another planet. I found that really, really satisfying because it was kind of like solving a puzzle and like just playing around with some numbers and solving a puzzle. That's probably not the most fascinating thing I've learned. I think one of the most interesting things I've learned is probably during my degree. My degree was physics with space science and technology when I was at university. So a friend of mine said that physicists love either two things. They either like the really, really small stuff like nanotechnology and things like that, or they really, really like the large stuff like astrophysics, rocket science, and things like that. And for me, that was the thing that I found the most interesting and the most satisfying. Was not astrophysics, it wasn't anything like that, but it was space science, and particularly space technology, putting, the physics of putting things into orbit, the physics of working out how much fuel you're going to need to send a rocket into space, and then the kind of like escalating problems of the rocket equation. So basically, to talk about rocket science very, very quickly, I will easily get distracted and talk about that, but to talk about it very, very quickly, if you want to launch something into space, you've got to have enough fuel to give enough energy, to give enough speed to launch that thing that you want into space. But the problem is that fuel has mass. So you're also going to need some more energy and some more fuel essentially to launch the fuel into space. But then you're going to need more fuel to launch the fuel that launches the spacecraft into space. So I found the mathematical equation, the rocket equation that explains what exactly you need or how much fuel you're going to need to launch a specific mass at a specific velocity, probably the most interesting topic that I have personally learned. But we're talking about hinterland here on the Late Late Show this evening with me, Rich Wrigley. I'm going to be honest, I first didn't really realize what hinterland was. I had to Google it a couple of times when I first started hearing it as a buzzword, because I think it's just something that a lot of teachers naturally do. And so for me, hinterland is really, really important in physics because it tells the story of physics, or using hinterland would tell the story of physics and the development of physics over time, but also the stories of the people involved in the development of physics. And so for me, some of the aspects of hinterland that I incorporate into my lessons is when I'm teaching about spectral or stellar classifications of stars, how we basically how we classify stars. The most interesting story about that is Annie Jump Cannon, the woman who came up with the way that we classify stars, was a human computer at a university about a century and a half ago doing calculations on this. She was also deaf, and I find that telling her backstory and how she actually developed it is far more engaging than just basically going, here's a list of how we classify stars by their color and by their surface temperature. And you need to learn it. If I also tell the backstory of the person who developed it, I find it helps kind of stick into the minds of students and helps it be more relatable. But also what's really, really important as well is that as a physics teacher, I remember growing up as a physics student and basically being told about a lot of old white men discovering things, and maybe now and then Marie Curie. That was basically it. And I think it's so important to have physics students see that physics is accessible to everyone, and also that physics, you can be, whoever you are, as long as you put the work in, you're going to be a good physics student. And I think telling the story of women in STEM, of people in color in STEM, really, really helps inspire and motivate students as well. So we're talking about hinterland, we're talking about theory of knowledge here on the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley, this evening. What are some of your favorite sort of hinterland moments in your classes? What kind of things do you do to incorporate inside of your lessons on hinterland? I would absolutely love to hear from you over the course of the next hour or so. And also, how do you motivate students to make sure for them to realize that what they're seeing is actually worthwhile, and why we should take a little bit of a veer off from the syllabus to look at some kind of hinterland concepts. I remember there was when I first ever started teaching, it was probably my NQT year. I was teaching a sixth form physics class, and there was an absolutely monumental solar flare that had been just captured on one of the solar observatories. Essentially, you would look at a picture of a sun and there would just be an insanely bright white spot, and I thought, oh, wow, this is really cool, this has just happened. So we took like 10 minutes to discuss it and work out how fast the light from the solar flare would reach us, but also that the solar flare was made up of highly charged subatomic particles that would be moving very, very fast, and we used basic equations to work out how fast or how long it would take them to reach the Earth, and then what would probably happen in terms of things like aurorae and the northern lights and things like that. And a load of the class was super engaged and really, really fascinated by it. And then there was one student who just put his hand up, and it absolutely deflated me. He just goes, "Sir, is this on the syllabus?" And I felt so dejected when that happened. I wish I would have said, yes, it is, but it's just, it's in this bit, and it's in this bit, and it's in this bit. Roger has just texted in as well. Please do text in. We're talking about motivating students, talking around the curriculum. Please do text in. I would love to hear your thoughts. I know what you mean about buzzwords, Rich. Roger texts in. So many people also pretend to know what they mean, and it's blatant that they don't. Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite TV shows is Trailer Park Boys, which is a Canadian comedy. And it came out, for people who don't know, it came out about 20 years ago now, which makes me feel incredibly old. And the idea was it's kind of a spoof reality TV show filmed in kind of the style of The Office. And it was basically, the idea was Cops, or the TV show Cops, but from the criminal's perspective. And so that, the people who were probably, getting into some nefarious activities. And there's also the running joke is one of the characters is a little bit dim and not very smart. And someone's just texted in to say, lol, I'm Julian, who is one of the characters there. Ricky is my name's Rich, and Ricky is my spirit animal in a lot of cases. And Ricky is being interviewed about an election, and the interviewer is going, what do you think about the incumbent this year? It's like, the what? And the incumbent. And Ricky's line is, what are you using your big school words for? Just use normal people words and I'll understand what I'm saying. Apologies for that. So for me, a lot of buzzwords come by, and also I've noticed teaching abroad, a lot of the buzzwords kind of pass us by in international education that are coming out in the UK. I mean, I know at the moment there's a lot of things like tags and CCGs and things like that I wasn't really sure until EduTwitter, until I had a quick scroll through EduTwitter and knew what was happening. But I think one of the biggest turnoffs to trainee teachers, but also to people wanting to improve in education, wanting to improve their practice, for want of a better word, is to is buzzwords and things like that, and things like hinterland and all of these kind of things. Core value added was one that I kept hearing all and all again. It really puts me off because I think I actually do this stuff. Like, for example, metacognition is a big word, and I was like, that popped up, and I'm like, what the heck does this mean? And then when I actually look at it and go, oh, it means this. Why can't we just use normal people words in education? Is what I'm a big advocate for. Plain, simple words that a blunt physicist or physics teacher can understand and use effectively. But we're talking about hinterland here on the Late Late Show, and Complex has texted in to say, how do you motivate your students? I think in physics, one of the most important things in physics is, especially when students are required in lower year groups, in younger year groups, I should say, to study physics. One of the things that really is important as a physics teacher is to motivate students because they think physics is hard, or they think it's not for them, or they're put off by it because there's this invisible barrier that pops up basically each time. And so for me, in terms of motivation, it's always been a constant battle of how do I actually motivate my students. I think the first thing is physics is a very practical based subject, and so for me the most important thing is doing as much practical work as I possibly can around a subject. Now, sometimes that's really tricky, especially when you're talking about very abstract concepts that you can't physically do in school. For example, when we're talking about radioactivity, sometimes it's very difficult to safely or successfully model an decay. So we can use modeling experiments in that case. But practical work is always probably some of the best work I find. I also find it's really good because then the students can actually motivate each other. It teaches them a lot of other key concepts that I think are really important, like communication, clear teamwork, organization, organization in terms of their notes and their methodical approach to physics, but also, keeping things tidy and, getting equipment, being responsible for equipment, putting it back, making sure it's safe and things like that. But also resilience. I think practical work kind of has an offshoot on encouraging students to be more resilient. And I think one of the things that we need to encourage as physics teachers, but also science teachers and other teachers in general, particularly teachers in STEM though, is failure is okay as long as taking a risk and maybe failing is okay as long as you learn from those mistakes. And I think that's a really important skill and life lesson that is so beneficial for students that we don't often realize, because we kind of expect perfection each time because of the nature of curriculums that we have to develop. So that's one way that I would motivate students. The other thing for me is imparting my own personal interest, and this goes back to hinterland again. I'm a big space nut, and I absolutely love everything to do with space. And I learnt very quickly at the start of my teacher training that a good majority of students may not like physics, but they love everything to do with space. There was an educational course I went on right at the start of my teacher training. There was a quote from, I don't remember who, but the quote said, there are two things that children love, dinosaurs and space, and the dinosaurs aren't coming back. And so for me, that was, let's use space as a way to motivate students. Now that could be something as simple as doing some orbital mechanics problems about satellites for older students, but it can also be really fun stuff like actually building a comet from scratch with younger students and getting them to see how, what a comet is made up of. And then the storytelling element of hinterland kind of just sort of filters through naturally. It's one of my favorite activities. So if you're a physics teacher, I would strongly encourage you to do the build a comet exercise or build a comet recipe. You don't actually need that much expensive equipment or material to actually build something that is a pretty good one-to-one replica of the material inside a comet. And so the comet is essentially a dirty snowball, a bit of a cliche to say, but it's made up of carbon dioxide, water, and a few other things. So if you want to make a comet with your students, year 7 in particular, or a year 6 transition class that you might have from a primary school, absolutely love this. What you'll need is some dry ice and you'll need to make sure that the dry ice is quite well ground up or as pellets or something like that before you start this, because you will have to mix this in. And if you just have a big, like 10-20 centimeter block of 10-20 centimeter block of dry ice, it doesn't mix up and it just doesn't work very well. But you'll need some ground up dry ice. Also, please be careful. Remember that your CO2 will sublimate, so make sure that the windows are well ventilated and things like that. And so the first element of a comet is dry ice. And then what I will do is add some of the other concepts that you can include as well, or the other content that you include inside of a comet. So the next thing that you would include as well is carbon. And so this can be as simple as just getting some barbecue briquettes, some charcoal or something like that, or carbon powder if you have it in your prep room, and throwing that in along with the dry ice in a big bucket somewhere. Make sure, what I normally do is put everything inside of a very, very heavy duty garbage bag that's inside of a bucket or a round bowl. And then what I'll add is a few other things. I'll add some silica, so some sand, and the weird things that always get the kids interested is I throw in a dash of Worcestershire sauce, which I still can't say properly, because there's amino acids inside of Worcestershire sauce, and there are trace elements of Worcestershire sauce. There are trace elements of amino acids inside of comets. That gets us then talking about what are the conditions for life? Where did life possibly come from? Could a comet landing on the Earth be the reason that we have life? Possibly not, but could be. So it gets us talking about that. I'll also add, you have to make sure you get permission from your head to do this, otherwise I just pretend. But you can also add ethanol, or failing that, sometimes I get a little like a little test tube or something of red wine or white wine, because methanol and ethanol are inside of comets as well. Obviously you could just put ethanol in, but it really gets the kids' attention when you pour in a little drop of white wine as well. They're like, what are you adding that for? And then the last bit is all of that is mixed up together already. The carbon dioxide will be sublimating just a little bit. Carbon dioxide will just be sublimating every little bit. You'll throw in some water as well, and then you'll be able to like take side notes as well about, the water is causing the CO2 to sublimate. Is the steam that's coming out actually CO2, or is it water vapor? And then other things as well. You'll be able to talk about the fact that CO2 is more dense than air, so it will sink. So one of the things that you can do is literally scoop up some of the CO2 that is coming off of the comet, and just grab it in like in a beaker or a cup or something like that, and pour it, the gas, onto people's heads and things like that, and they find that really, really cool. But then you'll mix all of this up together, you close the bag up, and then eventually you'll just pull out something that looks like this big bubbling freezing cold mess, and it looks exactly like a comet. And then we can have a big discussion about, okay, if I leave this out in the sun too long, what's going to happen? It's the water's going to melt. What's going to happen to the carbon dioxide? Oh, it's going to sublimate, right? So if a comet gets too close to the sun, what's going to happen? So for me, I think hinterland, yeah, it is a bit of a buzzword, but I think it's something that we just do naturally over as in our course of any teacher. But I would love to hear from you about how do what are some of your favorite hinterland moments in teaching your classes? Also, if you have any questions about theory of knowledge and what theory of knowledge in, please do text in. I would love to hear from you. We're just going to take a short pause to listen to the news, and we'll be back on the Late Late Show momentarily with me, Rich Wrigley.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News with Megan Goods.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News. Despite A-level results not being released until the 10th of August this year, many parents have already started to contact lawyers in anticipation of launching appeals against teacher assessment grades. Education lawyers quoted in The Guardian this weekend said parents are panicking about teacher bias in awarding grades, and whether special educational needs and disabilities will have been properly taken into account. Also quoted was Mary Bousted, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, who said her main concern was that teachers will just be left in the lurch by a Secretary of State who has created this situation. Ofqual have stated that schools must appeal grades if asked to by students, and that they have released sufficient guidance to teachers on how to avoid any grading bias. Gavin Williamson has been out this week reminding teachers of their legal duties regarding political impartiality, following an increase in anti-Semitic incidents in schools. The rise comes as students are becoming more politically aware and involved in the ongoing Israel-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East. Williamson stated teachers should act appropriately, particularly in the political views they express, and that pupils should be offered a balanced presentation of opposing views when political issues are raised. That was your daily education news briefing.
So you're listening to The Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. One of the things I found quite interesting about Hinterland there as well was in the news, Gavin Williamson talking about students not staying politically active. I think this has been a long time since I've taught in the UK, and so when I've taught abroad, students have asked me about my politics, of course, and I always say, look, I'm not going to talk to you about that. But one of the reasons I also give here in Mexico, but in other countries, is look, I'm a guest in your country. I don't think it's appropriate that I should be imparting my opinions onto you, but also I don't know enough. But I remember kind of going on a hinterland moment here. One of the things I remember when I was teaching in the UK, it was my second year teaching in the UK, and it was the 2010 general election, when politics was slightly nicer, I suppose. And my sixth form students were going to ask me how I was going to vote. And I knew that some of them were 18. I was like, look, I don't really think I should be discussing my politics with you, because I will have an innate bias, and either I will turn you off from voting because you don't like me, or hopefully you do respect me, and I might put my impartiality on you and affect how you vote. So we're talking about hinterland here, and how can we incorporate it more effectively into our lesson? Seb has texted in, and I would love to hear from all of you. Seb has just texted in to say, just thinking about this, thinking the same. My physics teacher was so boring, and it's no wonder I don't really like science. But listening to you, I feel I could have been inspired. Well, thank you so much. That is a really, really very kind thing to say. I hope that's something that I'm imparting onto my students. I know it is the case in sometimes, because obviously the best part of being a teacher, I would say, is getting a text, or like an email, or what text, you wouldn't get a text, but getting an email from your students, a former student getting in touch or in contact saying, I'm studying this at school, and this is down to you. And the year 13 leavers of my school have sent some lovely things to me saying, look, I've decided to study engineering, and that's down to you a little bit as well. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. I was very fortunate that I had a very nerdy household, for want of a better word. My brother is a physicist. My dad is a physicist as well, and we have a lot of kind of geeky orientated people inside of my family. So I remember growing up being obsessed with space, but also my dad worked for an aerospace company. He actually had designed some of the patents on, I think, the Eurofighter, and I think the old Tornado. And so before I was born, my family moved down to the south coast, to Southampton, to Eastleigh, to be more specific, because that's where the Spitfire was built, and that's where a lot of aviation companies still are. So I kind of owe my passion and interest to my dad and to my brother and things like that, and that made me want to study physics, because I saw the cool stuff that my family were doing. But also I was quite cynical about it as well. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something in physics, and I knew I was quite adept at it. But I also knew that studying physics would probably be a sound financial bet as well, because whatever I wanted to do, I would have a qualification in physics. So I'd probably get a half decent job out of it at the end of my 3 years of my bachelor's. I was just very lucky that during my bachelor's course, I was enrolled on the, I think it was called the undergraduate ambassador scheme, where you got 10 credits in your final year, and basically you would go in and act as a teaching assistant in a secondary school. That was really, really great for encouraging me to become a physics teacher. But also, I would say it is true that physics teachers do inspire you. I had several fantastic teachers. I was very, very fortunate. And I had some really, really fantastic maths teachers, physics teachers in GCSE, but also at A level as well. My physics teacher, my A level physics teacher, also taught me A level electronics for 2 years. Mr. Hayter in Barton Peveril College. He was an absolutely amazing physics teacher, and he would tell the most amazing stories and be so passionate about the subject, but also talk around the whole subject. And explain different things and say, like tell these really kind of long rambling stories, which is kind of where I've picked up my teaching style a little bit as well. I think my teaching style is a mixture of him and Billy Connolly minus the cursing, telling these long meandering rambling stories. And so I've been really fortunate to have a really wonderful physics teacher and also a wonderful family kind of inspiring me to become a physicist. And I suppose I hope I can do the same for students that aren't as lucky as I am to, have geeks in their family, I suppose. We're talking about how it's like teaching around the curriculum, aka Hinterland, and I'd love to hear from you. How do you incorporate Hinterland into your lessons? What kind of activities do you do? What is your style and approach to it? But also, what we've also in the past been talking about, or in the last hour, we've been talking about theory of knowledge and what is it. Do you have any questions about theory of knowledge and how to incorporate it into your classes? I'd love to hear from you. Please do text in. Salty has texted in and said, I really like the opportunity to allow discussion. Yes, we are curriculum driven, but we're also people driven, and allowing wider discussion can give them a real sense of ownership of the topic. I completely agree with that. One of the things of theory of knowledge as well is it is all discussion based, and that this is something that would infuriate a 17-year-old Rich Wrigley, but it's sort of like there are no wrong answers, and as long as you can justify and explain and think critically about the issues, it's something that's so important. And I think in a lot of subjects that are very curriculum driven, we do kind of lose sight of that as well, especially for subjects like maybe sciences, mathematics, STEM subjects, where there's a lot of content to learn. We can sometimes lose sight of the fact that, look, we should be allowing students to debate and share ideas. I think some subjects in STEM allow it more than others, but you just have to be creative and think about what would work in this situation. In terms of debate and allowing discussion, one of my favorite activities is when we get onto the energy topic in physics. One of my favorite topics in the energy section is energy production, which is a terrible way of phrasing it, but basically energy resources. And I get the students to have a debate discussing what is the best energy resource for the country that they are in right now, and arguing the pros and cons. And a lot of the time as well, I will check to see what students agree with already. So like, hands up, do you agree with this? Are you against this? And then I will switch the groups and make the students argue the alternative side and research it, because it's so important to make sure that students are able to sort of argue both sides of a story when that's appropriate, obviously, of course, and when with a lot of guidance as well. So you're listening to the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. We're talking about Hinterland. We're talking about opportunities for teaching outside of the curriculum. What are some of the opportunities that you implement in your lessons, outside of your lessons, in your school? I would love to hear from you and discuss it with you. One of the areas I find in a school to incorporate a lot of the sort of themes of Hinterland and all of this is actually something where it's actually outside of the school. I'm a big proponent of outdoor education and things like the Duke of Edinburgh Award, and if you're teaching in an international school, the Duke of Edinburgh International Award, because what I found is I've been a supervisor and an assessor for Duke of Edinburgh and the International Award as well for several years, and I found that First off, it's a really good opportunity to get to know your students outside of a school setting, especially when there is an element of challenge, especially when there is an element of failure, because they may fail this or may not be able to, to do something. It really gets you to see the students in a different light. But also, depending on how your schools run Duke of Edinburgh Awards, it also gets the students to see how you rise to a challenge as well. Because in a lot of international settings, from talking from my experience as an international teacher, we have to hike the trail with them in these students. So we have to kind of suffer along with them as well, because it's just the only way that we can actually safely accommodate the route. And so students will, see us suffering as well. And it's a really good opportunity for them to, bond is the best word, or develop that rapport with the students. But also we can show the practical applications of our subject outside of the classroom. And for me, it just comes from everyday things. I'm a bit of a tinkerer. So one time we were teaching the students how to read a compass. And obviously we teach about magnetic fields in class. And the first thing I said is like, look, you can't hold this compass over an iron fence, because it's going to knock the compass needle out of alignment. But then I also said, like, look, we were in Brazil, and building regulations aren't as strong as in Brazil as they are probably in the UK. So there was some like pretty hefty power cables just hanging over us, about 10 feet or 10 feet above us. And I was like, look, if I hold the compass up to here, it's going to wobble, it's going to go out of alignment as well, because of the electric field, because of the magnetic field that's created by the wire. And then just before that, in my physics class, we were talking about electric fields. I think put a little technical difficulty there. I hope you can hear me. So apologies for that. I just heard someone say the sound has gone. It's probably just because I was talking too long and people had drifted off. One of the scariest, fantastic. I'm great. People are texting in to say they can hear clearly. That's absolutely fantastic. One of my scariest hinterland moments actually came on the Duke of Edinburgh course in Brazil. It was I was supervising a year 12 silver expedition, I think. And I just taught some of these students about electric fields. And so I started off by talking or showing a picture of two people with their hair stuck up on end, similar to if you had a Van de Graaff generator, that big metal dome, that big metal ball that you put your hand on, makes your hair stick up on end. There's normally one in every science department, but there's also one in probably museums and things like that. Well, I showed a picture of two people with their hair stood up on end, like in the middle of a field. And then I just put a little caption going, why are we, the two people were smiling. Why are we smiling? We're about to get electrocuted by lightning. And so this was actually a picture taken from someone who was on the top of a hill with just before a thunderstorm struck, with their hair sticking up on end. Just before, luckily the people were okay, but they were just about to be caught in the middle of a thunderstorm. That happened about a week before I actually went on a Duke of Edinburgh expedition in Brazil, and we were camping on the top of a mountain. And you can kind of see where this is going already. So we were camping on the top of a mountain. We had just hiked. It's pretty heavy duty what we had to do. We had just hiked about 15 kilometers, which doesn't sound much, but there was about an 800 meter incline that we had traversed. We were on the top of the mountain, and there was some teachers there were some assessors. We also had a field guide with us, because the field guides was kind of a requirement, because in Brazil, we need someone who knows the route as much as we do, as much as they possibly can. And we noticed that one of the teachers, who had like a bob cut, blonde hair, her hair started standing up on end, and my heart just sank, and I was just there like, no, what are we going to do? This is the possibility of having a lightning strike. And the expedition guide looked at me and just went, we're going to need to get into lightning positions, which is a position I've never heard of. But basically what you have to do is you have to luckily the students had just put their tents up, and everything was still relatively unpacked apart from their tents. Their tents were up, but everything else was okay-ish. So what you have to do is, And the guide said this so brilliantly. He said, basically, if you get hit from the top, you're dead already. Like, as in, like, if lightning hits you from the sky, you're dead already. But if, like, there's also ground strikes where lightning will come up through the ground and strike up that way. Now you can prevent that, he said. I was like, oh, great, giddy. And I kind of saw where this is going. We need to insulate ourselves. So what we did is we got all the students to roll out their sleeping mats, then put their hefty duty 60-litre backpacks on that, and then have them sort of sit, put their butt and their feet sort of huddled up inside of their tents on their backpack, on their mats. And then we hadn't put our tents up yet, but we also did the same thing as well. And we were kind of just sitting there just going, oh gosh. And the scariest moment for me was, it was basically me and the other award leader walking around the camp, making sure all students were doing this properly, going like, look, we need to be in lightning positions, X, Y, and Z, and all of this kind of things. And we were thinking, I was thinking, well, if there's a ground strike now, we're the easiest point for the electricity to flow through us. So I'd very much like these students to do this all properly and quickly, so I can sit on my mat as well, please. And we did, and we had to wait about half an hour and pass the time. And it is a little nerve-wracking, but everyone was fine. And the storm had actually passed. And luckily, we didn't actually see any lightning. There was just a strong risk of it, and we had some heavy rains later on in the evening. So thankfully, I can tell this story looking back on it and smiling it. Every time I tell the story, my wife gets very furious with me and goes, "Why did you do that?" And I was like, "There's not much I can do about it." But every time now I teach about electric fields, I will tell this story to students, and they find it hilarious. And the students that were in that position as well, when we were teaching about it, we revisit it and go, look, this happened to us too, how interesting. And they were like, yeah, it was actually pretty cool, because kids are kind of tough like that and resilient. And yeah, there's someone's just texted in to say lightning positions. Yeah, there's nothing weirder than saying we need to get into lightning positions. The coolest thing about it as well was the guides were quite familiar with this, and they said, yeah, this happened to us a couple of months ago, and lightning struck about 20 meters away from us, and we could see the sparks fly up. And I was like, you are sounding very cool and calm about this, and way more than I would be in this case. And then another guide was like, you know what, I want a coffee. So he whipped out his stove and started boiling some water to make a coffee while we were waiting to be struck by lightning. So yeah, it's always important to kind of include these stories, I think, when you're teaching this context, because I think it gets students to remember the key concepts in your subject way more than just basically going, here's what an electric field is, here's the field lines for a sphere or whatever. But we've got another 20 minutes left on Teachers Talk Radio. We're going to pause ever so slightly for another commercial, and I will see you back in a couple of minutes.
Introducing Amanda Davey. Amanda is one of the first specialist teacher assessors for dyscalculia in the UK and offers dyscalculia tutoring and bespoke training for schools. With 26 years of teaching and tutoring experience in the UK, Amanda offers specialist online tuition focused on building confidence and developing skills. Amanda also
So thank you for that. So we've got sponsored. So you're listening to the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. We've been talking in the first hour of the show about theory of knowledge and what it is and how you can incorporate it. But that's also led to a wider discussion about hinterland, and also how can we incorporate aspects outside of our curriculum to help embed key ideas of our curriculum. I'd love to hear from you right now about either, how do you incorporate hinterland in your show, I should say. How do you incorporate hinterland into your lessons? What kind of things do you do? We found that a lot of people really like storytelling, but we've also told about like practical work, how it improves motivation, but also like group work, particularly course, group discussions, and how that can really give students an ownership of the course. So please do text in if you have any questions about what is hinterland, how can you improve, how can we incorporate it, but also what is theory of knowledge and how we can improve it. We've got another 20 minutes on the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley, this evening, or this afternoon, I should say, because I'm calling to you or talking to you live from Mexico City. And I'm just looking over in my office where I am right now, and one of the things that I'm really looking forward to is going back into school. We've been teaching online in Mexico for a year and 2 months now. All teachers were vaccinated in Mexico a couple of weeks ago. So we will all have like that 2 week sort of barrier for, immunity improving by the end of this week. And so from next week, we'll be starting to slowly open up and go back into school, obviously with COVID secure protocols. And that got me thinking about, right, the first thing I want to do with my students is a lot of practicals, but also a lot of sort of, group work and activity work, as long as it's safe to do so. But I'm also looking over at my desk here, and I have a load of postcards. I bought a 100-pack box of different postcards, and this is going to be the display for my my classroom or my lab this year. And it's all different astronomical bodies, from the solar system to outer space, galaxies, the universe, but in a very weird and different way. So for example, there's a really cool picture I have of Mars that actually includes the limb of Mars's atmosphere. I actually already showed that to some of my students and said, look, this is actually one of the examples of Mars having an atmosphere. This is a great example of then talking with my year 10s about atmospheric pressure and how atmospheric pressure is much lower on Mars, although it's still existing. And then that leads into a discussion about the Mars Ingenuity helicopter that was just launched. And then we could start discussing about what are the forces involved. Why do the rotor blades on the Mars helicopter need to spin so fast? And because the air is so thin compared to the air on Earth, but also why it's sometimes easier to launch, or you need less energy to lift a helicopter on Mars than you would on Earth, because it weighs less on Earth, and that would weighs less on Mars than it does on Earth. And that leads into then a discussion about weight and engineering and all the cool things we're doing right now. And so that can even just be stuff that's really simple, like interesting displays, motivational displays. But I think it really does come back to storytelling, and how can we use storytelling to make this a little bit, make abstract concepts more interesting, but also ground them in the real world as well. So I would love to hear from you for the last 15 minutes of the show. We are talking about Hinterland and how we can incorporate those into our lessons. What tips and tricks do you use? Does your school have a policy on this, or not at all? Do you have any questions or discussion points about Hinterland? I would love to answer any questions that you have in the last 15 minutes of the show. You're listening to me, the Late Late Show, me, Rich Wrigley, on the Late Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio. So I think one of the things that I find really interesting as well, in terms of teaching around the curriculum, especially at this time of year, is either including the Olympics or the World Cup or the Euros in my physics teaching. And so there's a lot of opportunities in physics to kind of engage some people who may not necessarily be interested in physics. We were talking at the start of the show about the IB diploma program and how theory of knowledge links into that. Well, one of the things that all students have to do in the IB diploma program is they have to do a science subject. It's the fourth subject that they take, or the fourth group of subjects that they take. And every student has to do at least one science. And so normally those sciences are the traditional three sciences, so biology, chemistry, or physics. But there's also opportunities for things like computer science, sports science, environmental systems and societies. And some schools even offer courses like astronomy, but that's very rare to kind of include. So most students will have to pick from, biology, chemistry, or physics, and then maybe things like computer science or sports science or environmental science and things like that. And one of the things that all students have to do during the course is they have to do something called the Group 4 project. So it's called the Group 4 project because all sciences fit under the fourth group of subjects. And what we do is we have to mix students by different subjects, and they have set a group task or a group research project that they have to do. And so one of those things is, so what we would normally do is we will mix a biologist with a chemist, with a physics student, and maybe an environmental student. So we have like 4 different students, or students from different academic backgrounds or academic subjects, working on a project together. And then they have to work on a research question around an overall theme. And the theme is really interesting. So last year, the theme we used was space exploration, because I was in charge of the Group 4 project last year, and you may notice that I like space, but also SpaceX had just launched their crewed vehicle for the first time. So we thought that would be a really interesting option. And it gave students a really good opportunity to come up with some really, really cool projects. So a sports scientist came up with the idea of, right, let's do a research project about the effects of weightlessness over a certain amount of time. And, what is the effect on muscle tissue and bone marrow? And so students will spend about 10 hours coming up with a quick research question and then answering it. Normally it's in the style of kind of like an academic fair, like a science fair. They can do experiments if they wish, or they can just do, secondary data and research along those lines as well. Going back to this time of year and things like the Euros, the Olympics, or the World Cup, if it's happening, one of the themes that we use a lot for group projects, particularly for the Group 4 project, but we've also done it in terms of like science fairs for the younger students, is the World Cup or the Olympics. So a couple of years ago, when I was teaching in Brazil, the Olympics had just happened as well. So one of the themes we used for our Group 4 project was the Olympics. And students did some really, really cool research projects based on just that open-ended theme. So some of the questions that they came up with and that they generated and asked and answered was, one student who was a chemist said, what is the most efficient fuel for the Olympic flame? And he was basically, I want to set things on fire, but I want to use it as an excuse to do my Group 4 project. So he got different fuels and he worked out the efficiency of different fuels. Another student said, what's the best throw that you should launch a javelin at in order to get the best distance? And so they built basically a little mini javelin trebuchet, very tiny thing. It could launch like a matchstick javelin essentially. And they measured what would be the optimal angle. And so theory would suggest that you should launch it at 45 degrees. But when you factor in things like air resistance, it should be 30 degrees. That was a really cool experiment. My favorite one as well was, what would be the best strategy to win the biathlon? And so the biathlon in the Winter Olympics is you have to ski very quickly around a course, and then you have to shoot certain targets. But the problem is that if you ski very fast, your heart rate goes up, and then you're not able to keep the rifle steady while you're shooting the target. So just from a very open-ended theme, and by encouraging students to work together in groups where they may not necessarily work well, or may not necessarily work together normally, you would get some really, really interesting sort of discussion points, some really interesting ideas. And it's going back to taking control of their own learning and their own ownership. Yes, of course, we have to meet our curriculum content, and we're kind of lucky in the respect that the IB mandates, or IB science teachers are required to spend a certain amount of time doing this Group 4 project. Otherwise, it's a requirement of the course. But it's definitely something that we should consider, in a lot of other courses as well, whether, should we mandate time for students to collaborate and work together? Because if we're just thinking about teaching the curriculum and the core content, we're really doing our students a disservice and letting them miss out on certain key points. We've got another 10 minutes on the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. We're going to pause again for the news. And then afterwards, I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts about Theory of Knowledge, Hinterland, the IB diploma? 10 more minutes to answer your questions here on the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News with Megan Goods.
This is your latest Teachers Talk Radio News. Despite A-level results not being released until the 10th of August this year, many parents have already started to contact lawyers in anticipation of launching appeals against teacher assessment grades. Education lawyers quoted in The Guardian this weekend said parents are panicking about teacher bias in awarding grades, and whether special educational needs and disabilities will have been properly taken into account. Also quoted was Mary Bousted, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, who said her main concern was that teachers will just be left in the lurch by a Secretary of State who has created this situation. Ofqual have stated that schools must appeal grades if asked to by students, and that they have released sufficient guidance to teachers on how to avoid any grading bias. Gavin Williamson has been out this week reminding teachers of their legal duties regarding political impartiality, following an increase in anti-Semitic incidents in schools. The rise comes as students are becoming more politically aware and involved in the ongoing Israel-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East. Williamson stated teachers should act appropriately, particularly in the political views they express, and that pupils should be offered a balanced presentation of opposing views when political issues are raised. That was your daily education news briefing.
So that was the news, and something just pops into my head as I was listening to that. One of the things was hearing about lawyers being contacted over grades. It just reminded me of the Lionel Hutz quote from The Simpsons going, "Can you imagine a world without lawyers?" And then he flashes to one of those cloud thought bubbles and everyone's just holding hands, dancing, kind of like the Coca-Cola advert, "Buy the world of Coke" kind of thing. And he shudders. And then it just reminded me that I basically think in Simpsons quotes and Simpsons memes. I grew up at the time when The Simpsons was fantastic, and I'm also very fortunate here that in Mexico The Simpsons is very, very loved, and is actually students to this day still love The Simpsons. One of the students in year 10, I think, I was talking about how kids in other countries don't like The Simpsons anymore. They went, "But The Simpsons is timeless." Well, and then they even said, "Well, the first seasons are." I was like, "What?" Okay. But it just reminded me of one of probably the greatest hinterland blags of my professional career, which is I really wanted to watch an episode of The Simpsons with my students for the end of term, but obviously that has no academic merit. So I decided to create a revision activity based around an episode of The Simpsons. So we would watch the episode Deep Space Homer. That's the episode where Homer goes into space with Buzz Aldrin making a cameo as himself. And from that, I would use scenes from The Simpsons to create a project for students to actually answer these physics-based problems. So students would discuss about atmospheric pressure, centripetal force, Newton's laws of motion, but also things like like kinematics and how much energy it needs to launch a satellite and things like that, while we were watching an episode of The Simpsons. And I think one of the most important things in terms of this buzzword of hinterland and things like that is how can we effectively incorporate it. And I think it really does come down to sort of like your own personal interests, but also having a passion and a willingness to share those personal interests with your students. And if you're passionate and enthusiastic about your course, and if you're a little bit geeky like me, then you'll find that the students kind of really warm to that as well, and find it, they'll listen to your rambling and meandering stories about standing on sitting on a rock in Brazil, nearly getting struck by lightning because it's related to electric fields in your IB physics course. We're going to leave it there. That was we're coming up on an hour and a half. This has been the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. Please join me again next week, where we'll be discussing another couple of issues related to teaching and education, primarily in physics, but welcome to everyone here is welcome as well. So this has been the Late Late Show with me, Rich Wrigley. I hope you have a lovely and restful evening, and I will see you all, or I will hear you all next week. Take care, everyone.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.